Well, in the past 2 weeks, not one, but two billionaire businessmen have gone to space, paving the way for the ultra wealthy to become astronauts in the future. But our next guest says that if you plan to buy a seat on a rocket ship, expect to pay a tax. We're joined now by Oregon Congressman Earl Blumenauer and Chief Political Correspondent Jessica Smith. Congressman, great to have you here with us. So I do want to start with that tax. Who would have to pay it? And is it for space tourism only, or is it going to be for all new space exploration that we're going to see coming down the pike?
This would be a tax simply on space tourism. It doesn't impact people who are working on research projects, but it is if you buy an airline ticket to take your family to Legoland, you pay a tax. And just because people are billionaires and they're going into space, I think they too should be able to help support the nation's infrastructure needs. Space travel, after all, would not have been possible without hundreds of billions of dollars of federal investment. And I think treating them just like we would treat other tourists makes sense and helps us deal with our infrastructure needs.
Hi, Congressman Jessica Smith here. Wondering if you can talk about what you'd like to see this revenue that gets brought in used for. Do you have specific ideas in mind? I know you've been concerned about the climate impact of all of this.
Well, to be sure, the estimates are that a space launch accounts for 60 times greater emissions than transatlantic flights on a per passenger basis, enough to drive a car all the way around the Earth. It might well have an opportunity to help us on efforts to mitigate climate impacts, but also infrastructure. We're in the process of trying to figure out how we provide the money to rebuild and renew America. Clearly, we're on the edge of something that's going to grow exponentially over time. There are hundreds and hundreds of people who've signed up to pay rather extraordinary, expensive tickets to be in space for a couple of minutes. I think we ought to get ahead of the curve, have resources to help rebuild and renew America, and perhaps mitigate the environmental impact.
I'm curious if you've had conversations with your colleagues on the other side of the aisle. We've seen them be very hesitant, resistant to raising taxes at all. Have you had any conversations with them about this?
We just started this last week. I anticipate having conversations with our Ways and Means Committee members who would be involved with tax matters, and also with the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. I've gotten some feedback from the leadership of that committee who think it's a good idea. And they see what happens with airline traffic that is taxed. And they think as we move into this new realm of space tourism, it makes sense.
Congressman, I want to ask you about some of the regulatory issues, and we've seen a lot of concerns, at least just recently, with the FAA and companies like Boeing, for example. What kind of expansions do you think are really going to need to be made to the FAA so that we can really handle space tourism more safely and obviously more commercially going forward?
Well, we're just scratching the surface here. There is clearly a demand. There are several companies that want to be involved with it. And we're entering into a new era in terms of space activities. There's lots of private satellites being launched. There's great interest in space tourism. Others want to have space stations. There's going to be a responsibility for the federal government to regulate this. So everything from space junk to space congestion and safety. We're just scratching the surface now, but regardless, it seems to me clear that it's going to require some money to do it right. And I think taxing like we would if they were going to Disney World makes sense.
What's the timeline on this? When are you hoping to actually get this proposal finalized? And then eventually, what's the timeline to get this passed?
Yeah. Well, we've started circulating proposals. I'm having a meeting soon with people. I didn't realize how many people have been involved with these areas. who have ideas about how it should happen. So we're going to talk it through, have people comment on opportunities, challenges, different ways of levying a tax. And there's talk of a two-tiered system for different length of trips. It's not going to be something that's going to happen anytime soon. I anticipate getting this out, drafting the legislation, being able for people to critique it. But there will be more infrastructure legislation that's going to happen later in the fall. And I'd like something ready if legislation starts to move that we could incorporate it.
I do want to ask if there is going to be plans to funnel any of this tax revenue, from the space tourism, perhaps to American space exploration, to NASA, to aerospace research, or do you think it's just going to essentially join the pot for the budget?
Well, we have lots of expenses that are going to be incurred, as I mentioned, some of the challenges in terms of space congestion, space safety, space junk. Having the tax, making it available for our infrastructure needs, I think is fine if people want to particularize it. But I see this as entirely separate from what we do with NASA and activities for our own research and space activities. This is just space tourism. And it's, as I say, it's just like people going to Disneyland pay a tax. People who are going to go up in space pay extraordinary amounts of money for a few minutes of weightlessness. There's no reason they shouldn't pay as well.
All right, we'll have to leave that there. Congressman Earl Blumenauer from Oregon, Chief Political Correspondent Jessica Smith, thank you both for joining us today.